Written in Stone is co-created by Power Company Climbing. Products, training plans, and education to help you become a better climber. PowerCompanyClimbing.com. Use the code STONE, that's STONE, for 20% off of almost everything. Learn, grow, excel. Season 1 of Written in Stone, the 1990s, is supported by Tension Climbing. Wooden training tools designed with purpose in Denver, Colorado. Use the code STONE, that's STONE, to get 10% off of your next purchase at tensionclimbing.com and to let them know that their support for this show matters. Not valid for tension board sets, hardware, or gift cards. Cannot be combined with other offers. tensionclimbing.com. Mastery over success. This is a story of two routes. Because we almost can't mention one without the other, because putting the focus on one does a disservice to both, particularly when the climber, one of only two on the planet, has done both routes. And so in the beginning of October 2020, when Buster Martin clipped the chains on Britain's most famous test piece for only the 10th ascent in over 30 years, the story was only half complete. A year later, a finger injury threatened to end the story prematurely. And that was bad news, because the second half of this story, well, it's all about the fingers. It was actually a finger injury that stopped the legendary Ben Moon himself from becoming the first to tell the whole story. But Buster's smart. He built back up slowly, progressively overloading his fingers on the mono and two-finger pockets he'd need to have on lock. And a year later, he was there, standing in the Waldkopf in the Frankengura, beneath the imposing, inspiring limestone bulge that was the stuff of legend. It was nearly exactly 2 years since he'd added his name to the list of successful suitors of Hubble, and he was here in Germany to add his name to an even more exclusive list. Not just to the list of people who had done this route, because that list is a who's who of legendary climbers, not to mention the ones who've wanted it so bad they had to lie about having done it. No, he was here to become only the second person in history to have clipped chains on the two most famous sport routes of the 1990s, standard-defining routes that have transcended whatever grade is attached to them. Ben Moon's Hubble and Wolfgang Gulich's Action Directe. Today, though, he was out for a photo shoot and didn't even really want to be climbing, and this was the fifth go of the day. He was thinking mostly about getting to the pub. But if you're going to pull on, why not give it? From the jump, literally, things started going wrong. He wasn't hitting the holds how he'd practiced, some of the pockets were wet, and he was improvising on the go. High on the route, going for a pocket where he needed two fingers, he came up short, only getting one. And he was coming off. But then, he wasn't. What he was making history. Buster Martin, welcome to Written in Stone. Man, I'm glad you are here.
Yeah, man, thanks for having me. That was cool to listen to. That felt very nostalgic. It's a pleasure to talk. It's a pleasure to be on here to talk about those two routes. I'm flattered.
Yeah, I one of the things I'm most excited about this series is, and I didn't anticipate this when I started writing these episodes, is that everyone else that I'm trying to talk to is also really excited about talking about these routes, you know? So to me, that's really cool to see the excitement on your face the whole time I'm reading this story and watching you go back in time. I love it.
Yeah, man, for sure. It's cool how these routes these routes and these climbers meant so much to so many different people.
Yeah, totally. Before we really dive in here, though, I have a question I have to know the answer to. If you had to choose, which would it be? Punk rock and dreadlocks, or red and white striped lycra, a mustache, and feathered back hair?
I don't know. I think the I don't fancy myself in the lycra, so I think I'll go for the dreads.
I was sure you were going feathered hair and the mustache. I don't know. The punk rock and dreadlocks, he also had lycra at the same time, so you're kind of screwed
Yeah,
there. It's
yeah,
lycra no matter what.
yeah. Confident guys. I don't think I've got it in me.
Well, man, I spoke with Adam Ondra recently, and he said that it's hard to find a route with great aesthetics, great movement, and world leading difficulty. Like those were his three criteria. And many people say Hubble lacks some of these criteria. Why do you think it's more famous, like worldwide anyway? I don't know what it's like in the UK, but worldwide, why is it more famous than something like liquid amber, which even Ben has said is a much better route?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think for me, there's a fourth part of it. I guess if it depends if you're looking for the hardest route in the world. But for me, when I'm looking to repeat a route, I think history is also another really important thing. So Hubble and Liquid Amber both have the history. But
Mhm.
I imagine Hubble was more in the limelight because it was, at the time, Ben gave it 8C plus, and it was the first 8C plus in the world. And then Liquid
Right.
Amber, which was climbed just a month before, it was maybe just considered another 8C, even though to me and to many other climbers, it's a very special route and now seems to have settled at 8C plus. It was probably because it wasn't a first and maybe it got less attention in the magazines. And now I
Mhm.
think Hubble has kind of become a little bit more famous than it was a few years ago because of this sort of the grade discussion between Action Direct and Hubble. So I think that's made Hubble in people's heads a little bit more recently.
Totally. It always comes down to grade whether we want it to or not.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
that just comes up, bubbles up to the top always.
Yeah. And it's not to say that I think Hubble really has the movement. Like it's very technical movement and it's very
Yeah.
inspiring movement. But yeah, the line just isn't there. But when you know what it is and you turn up at the crag, I still look at it and it still provokes some sort of emotion in me. I look at it and see it as something which is like brutally hard. And so visually, there's still kind of something there for me, even if it's not the
Yeah.
prettiest bit of rock.
Yeah, totally. I get that. Like even like when I travel to a new area, I want to go and see the test pieces. Even if I have no business climbing on them,
Yeah.
or if I have no agenda to climb on them, I still wanna go see them. Like, there's just
Yeah, for
something about
sure.
looking at that chunk of rock that
Yeah.
provokes this, like, historical, idealism in us, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
And, speaking of that, like, history, there's something I wanted to ask you because I was reading about Hubble. I've never been to Raven Tor. I was trying to understand its like position on the wall and how the crag looks. And I had read that Hubble joins Revelations at the top, but I also read that Revelations is essentially the direct start to the prow, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Does Hubble join Revelations at the top?
So yeah, they both start independently, and they have the cruxes of them are at the bottom, and then they meet in the middle, about halfway up, and then both of them finish on a rather sketchy technical slab, which has got a bit of a run out in, and no one wants to add another bolt because the run out's kind of become part of it, and it feels spicy.
Sure.
Like it's you really have to stand on your feet, and it's kind of like the last thing you want after you've just done Revelations or you've just done Hubble, and it adds something to it. But yeah, you could absolutely continue both of the routes to the top of the crag. So Revelations has been done to the top. It's called Rage, but no one's done Hubble to the top, which seems a shame. That'd be good to do.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating that right there in that one route, it's like first Ron Fawcett climbed the prow,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then
yeah,
Jerry does the direct start to the prow, and then Ben comes in with this even harder start that eventually joins up with the roots. So having
yeah,
the the Fawcett, Moffett, and then Andy Pollitt is kind of the one who turned Hubble into a potential sport climb, calling it Horror Babylon and just pulling on the draws at the bottom. So
Yeah.
there's so much British climbing history, world climbing history right there in that one little section of rock. It's fucking fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's very, very cool. I remember a few years ago being at the Crag and a group of school kids were there, and they were on like their geography trip or something like that, and they all had their goggles on and a hammer and chisel, and they were getting dangerously close to they were getting dangerously close to Hubble. I think we had to pull them away for it. It got a bit tense for a moment.
Wow, that's amazing. They were gonna chip Hubble into 14C. So after doing a bunch of this research, and some of these things I already knew, but like rereading Jerry's book and Ben's book, and just looking online and rewatching Statement of Youth, and learning more and more about this route. Number one, I got more and more excited about British climbing history. Like I think there's a whole podcast series of British climbing history that needs to be done. Maybe Niall needs to narrate that or something.
Yeah.
But there are a few things I think that really contributed to raising the standards of UK climbing, which then in turn raised standards in the world during the 80s and 90s. And first, I think, is the dole. Like it's wild to me that there was this whole group of climbers who were essentially being paid, as in the mid 1980s, unemployment was huge in the UK. And the government was giving a stipend to pretty much everybody, no questions asked. And they just had to come and sign on every couple weeks and they would get a little money. And that created this whole band of full-time climbers who were like living in a rundown house and had all congregated in Sheffield and were just climbing everything. And, standards were changing, or like the ethics were changing at the same time. And I think that's the second thing. Ben and Jerry adopted those French ethics almost immediately, these hang-dogging ethics that were not the way people were climbing at the time. And then the third, I think, are the cellar walls. And that's what I want to talk to you a little about. First, what made the cellar walls so important? Is it the weather there? Are climbers just forced inside all the time?
Yeah, I imagine the weather was a big factor. It's funny what you say though about the dole and all of these things, how it all came together, and it was almost as if Hubble and Liquid Amber were like a culmination of the last decades of going to France, Jerry going to America. He learned from John Gill, from Backer, and then came and taught it all to Ben. They were training outside Stony Middleton, going to Cressbrook, traversing on the brick edges. And then finally, I think it was that last thing. They were already very good climbers, but then it was the addition of the steep board climbing, of the proper powerful training, and applying and maybe learning from some of the mistakes they'd learned in the decade before, and then like getting some serious training done on the board. And I love the board, but I think it's also important to remember that it was all of these things coming together. Because I think people really like the idea of like this one exercise that led to this ascent. It was like, what fingerboard routine were you doing before you climbed the hardest route in the world? But
right.
I think it was everything in the decade that came together, and then the board climbing was really the cherry on top. And Sheffield's, there's a lot of boards there, and it's probably because of the weather. It's a post-industrial city, so there's a lot of empty warehouses, and also the cellars as well allowed people to put those boards in.
I also think that the like rudimentary style of those early cellar walls, just having these, little tiny wooden holds all over the place, really basically simply made, was probably pretty important to what they were doing, because that was the style of climbing of the day. I love giant slopers and compression climbing. And I think if you're going to have a board, you should have some big slopers on them. But
Yeah.
at the time, compression climbing wasn't even really a thing. So it was all fingery little holds. That's what they were looking for outside. And that's what Hubble was. That's what Action Direct was. So
Yeah.
they were training exactly specifically for the things that they wanted to do.
Yeah, for sure. It maybe wouldn't have been as effective if some of the French climbers were maybe using the board to go out and do some of those long French
Mhm.
routes in the
Yeah.
south of France. But I think to the style of climbing in the Peak District and in Germany as well is very specific. But I think another thing which is maybe sometimes overlooked is actually that brick wall traversing. So there's a place called Broomgrove Wall on a wall on the side of one of the universities in Sheffield.
Yeah. Is this the one Adam Ondra climbs in the video?
Yeah, I think they took Ondra there. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's really crimpy, like really ratty little holds. And I think that combined with the board climbing, you've got like the raw finger strength and then like a bit more power from the board. I think it was a good combination.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because I recently, just a few years ago, found an old training notebook of mine
Yeah.
from when I was a relatively new climber, and I had been shown this brick wall in Cincinnati by some of the like old school traddies that seemed
Hmm.
to have endless endurance, like the
Yeah.
legends of climbing in the town I grew up in. And this wall was in a city park, and it was the building that housed the pump for this fountain.
Yeah.
So it was called the pump house, and
Nice.
we would traverse back and forth on these bricks, and there was a very specific sequence, and I had in my notebook, it's above a sidewalk, and you could count the partitioned off concrete, chunks on the sidewalk, and that's how I counted it in my notebook. Like, got 4 today, got 6 today,
Yeah, nice.
finished the traverse, started the reverse traverse, and then I would just for years, I just went and traversed back and forth on these bricks.
Yeah, that's cool. Like
Definitely made a big difference.
the beginning of sort of structured training. I think the thing those wolves gave people, like these days, everyone's good at like hanging on a nice uniform edge or jumping around on the moonboard and like producing a lot of force on bigger holds. But I think it's really a skill in itself, learning to like pull down on a ratty edge, especially to apply it to the Peak District.
Yeah, for sure. And I know you're a coach as well, and one of the things I think gets missed in a lot of the conversation today, maybe partly because of boards, and I've criticized boards for this a little bit. It's not the board's fault though; it's our fault as climbers. Is the like loss of control between moves, or always being
Yeah,
dynamic, always moving with
yeah, yeah,
momentum when it's tiny little bad uneven edges that you kind of have to wriggle your fingers into, you have to
yeah,
move with a pretty large degree of control sometimes.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and those kinds of walls really taught me that.
Yeah, nice.
I know Malcolm Smith, before he did the second ascent of Hubble, he built a replica of the Crux on a
Yeah.
board in one of those cellars. Um, and then very famously, like, did a photo shoot where he could just stop and chalk up in the middle of the Crux. Uh,
Yeah.
did you employ anything like that? And how much do you think it helped if you did?
Yeah, so that's a cool story about Malcolm. I think he was actually training up in Scotland by himself, and I always sort of romanticized this idea of like Malk just up in Scotland by himself, no one around, no training partner, just like
Totally.
locking
Yeah.
himself in the boardroom in like Glasgow or somewhere rainy and miserable, just like going at the boards. And I think when I was training for Hubble, it was during the first COVID lockdown in the UK.
Mm,
And even though
we're
I
in
was
the
at
same scenario.
yeah, even though I was in like sunny Hertfordshire and I built my board outside, but I definitely remember thinking about Malk, and I made these little replicas, and at the time we were having like these board meetings on Zoom.
Hmm.
So everyone would we would all get on Zoom and like boulder together, and people
I
would show
love
off
it.
their boulder problems. And my friend Jim Pope, he was also working on his Hubble replica, and I set a
Nice.
few different Hubble replicas. So that was all good fun. In terms of how much it helped, I think with replica training, you've kind of got to think about how specific you can actually make it. And I knew that on my board, I was never going to be able to make anything like Hubble because it's on a stepped overhang and I'm not
Right.
very good at setting. So I think my approach, and I also didn't feel like I needed to get too specific. I didn't want to sacrifice everything else in my climbing just to train for this one boulder problem. You know, I think it makes sense if you're like at the top of your game, you've been climbing for a very long time and you've got this like lifelong project you want to do, or you really want to do this climb. But I was still thinking about other stuff. So it was just something I was doing a little bit, and I had like a circuit of Hubble problems rather than one super specific one. So I thought it would be better just to cover all bases and make a lot of things that are similar rather than something which was meant to be exactly the same but ended up being nothing like it. And I was also doing some specific weight training for Hubble. So doing a lot of bent over rows, bicep curls. The biceps are pretty important on Hubble, like undercuts and core tension. And also doing some fingerboarding in a supinated position, because nearly every hold is some sort of undercut. So I was just pulling in that position and getting stronger in the wrists. However, that summer I ended up not really climbing. So I'm not sure if any of the... So I trained for about a month, like doing all of that stuff, a month or 6 weeks. And then that summer I was setting up my coaching business. So I didn't really climb. But I think when I was stood underneath the root, maybe all of the strength gains had gone, but I felt a familiarity with the route, and I felt like I knew it a little bit more, and it didn't feel as intimidating because I've been practicing all of these moves and it had been like a fun thing with my friends. So in that way, I think it helped.
I think that's really important. And I would love to talk, take a little tangent for just a second, because you are a coach. And you're one of the few people I've heard echo my own sentiments about the popularity of building replicas.
Yeah.
I think they're valuable, but I don't necessarily think they're valuable for the same reasons everyone else does. And I don't know that they might be more harmful than valuable to someone who's like, relatively new to climbing. You've been in it a couple of years and you're just looking to climb your like first 7B or something. Unless that's the absolute top of your scale that you're ever going to climb. I think it's better to spread yourself around and become more adaptable instead of more conditioned to this really specific thing.
Yeah, man. I totally agree with that. I think the sooner you get specific and the earlier you get too specific, I think you're taking away from your long-term progress. And I think the older you get, the harder it becomes to think about the long term. Because I remember when I was a teenager, the training was always about what I'm going to be doing in 10 years' time. And then now it's always about the next trip. And by doing that, maybe you miss out on really working your weaknesses and doing things that are going to help you in the long term as a climber.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I love what you said about that you felt like it, by doing this thing that included your friends and was fun, it felt like you had some familiarity with the route when you walked up to it. And I think that's really important. And maybe that's the most important part of it, especially for the climbers who are, still have a ways to go in their climbing journey, is to maybe build that familiarity so you can walk up to it and feel ready, feel like you prepared specifically.
Yeah.
But maybe you don't have to do as super specific training as is sort of becoming popular right now.
Yeah. So it's like you could turn up and you're being like, I feel comfortable to use a 2-finger pocket, or I feel good on this type of crimp, but I've not designed my whole life and my whole climbing around this one piece of thing. And then maybe even miss the mark when you've tried to do that.
Right, right. Well, this is not my training podcast, so we're gonna we're gonna get off that tangent. Um, but you just mentioned like preparing for the next trip, and right now you're in the Frankenjura, and I'm curious. You have. I think when this comes out, people won't have heard the Action Direct episode yet, but you did hear it. And I'm curious, did that play into your decision to go to the Frankenjura, or were you already planning this trip?
Yeah, I remember saying I listened to that and it gave me like goosebumps. I was so psyched to listen to it, and I remember saying to you like, I'm going to book a flight to the Jura. I mean, I'd kind of
Yeah.
been thinking, I kind of been thinking about it, but it definitely inspired me to go back. I mean, I was out there belaying a friend at Action today, so it brought back some memories. It's really cool. Yeah,
Oh
I think
man, I
people are
love
going to enjoy
that.
that.
I love it. Even if only 10 people listen to this podcast, that's the best possible outcome that you were psyched to go back.
Yeah, yeah.
And you just said you're out there belaying a friend on Action, and I think that partnership element is so important to climbing hard and to pushing each other.
Mm-hmm.
And we've mentioned several times that Ben had Jerry and Jerry had Ben. You know, they pushed each other and they competed with each other. And they've both been open about, yeah, we had some falling outs, you know,
Yeah.
but we'd always come back and we'd always be wondering, what's the other person doing and trying to compete. I'm curious, do you have a Jerry in your climbing, or have you ever?
Oh, I don't think I've ever had anyone where I've been sort of like competing with them at all, where it's been like a head-to-head competition. But I've certainly had a lot of mentors and a lot of people that have given me guidance, helped me with my training, and encouraged me and really supported me. And I think that maybe Jerry gave quite a lot of that to Ben. I know they sort of became rivals. They sort of became
Definitely
rivals.
started as a mentor sort of role.
Yeah. And I think that probably gave Ben, I mean, I'm sure it maybe would have got there without it, but I think it gave him a bit of a head start because Jerry had been to America. He'd seen the training that they were doing. He'd been to Germany. He was friends with Wolfgang. And I think that Ben got to learn a lot of that straight away and then travel around with the best climber in the world, which is usually pretty good for your climbing.
Yeah. I think we can safely say that that's a pretty good way to get better at climbing.
Yeah, for sure.
Who were your mentors?
It's quite a long list. So I think the original climbing instructors, Phil and Ben, who first taught me how to tie in, how to belay, and then later some coaches at the Westway as part of the Westway squad were really influential in my climbing. Neil Gresham introduced me to that. And then later moving to Sheffield, I mean, that's the great thing about Sheffield. I remember moving there and you go to the wall or you go to the supermarket and I was seeing all of these people who I'd been reading about in the, I remember seeing like Ron Fawcett in the market once. And then you go and see Ben,
Really?
Ben Moon at the schoolroom, Steve McClure at the Foundry. So you get to meet a lot of people and it's really cool. And being sponsored by Moon and spending time training with Ben at the school's been really cool experience as well. He's been very supportive of me.
Yeah, when you were doing Action Direct, I think I remember seeing that Ben was getting texts from you about how it was going. I don't know if it was that way with Hubble as well, but how fucking cool is it to be working on these like historical 90s iconic routes and texting with a guy who was right there in the thick of it as the best climber in the world at the time?
Yeah, that was very, very cool. If you'd have told the 10-year-old Buster that I'd be like having a beer with Ben Moon chatting about like Hubble and Action Direct, I mean, yeah, it was very cool. Although I felt slightly cheeky when I was texting videos of me with the knee bar on the knee bar of Hubble. I'm not sure what you thought of that one. I think he's forgiven me.
I love that. And I also just love that you were texting him about the knee bar or videos of you in the knee bar.
Yeah.
I know that can be a thorny subject a little bit, and let's talk a little bit about that because I think there are a few debates around Hubble or that sort of
Hmm.
concern Hubble. And one of those is this knee bar and especially using a knee pad in the knee bar. And I know you sort of debated it and you were hesitant at first, but you did end up using a knee pad. And why did you end up using it?
Yeah, to be completely honest, I remember seeing photos of people trying Hubble with the knee pad and actually having a little bit of a giggle about it and thought, how could you do that? Like, how could you do that? It's Hubble. And I remember turning up there's another route at Raven's Tor called Mecca, which people didn't used to do with a knee bar, but now everyone does it with a knee bar. And I turned up as like
That's the Martin Atkinson route, right?
yeah, exactly. Really cool route. Really classic 8B plus. It's sort of like everyone's first 8B plus from Sheffield. And the knee bars made it slightly easier, but I think it's still 8B plus. And I remember turning up at the crag as a 15-year-old and people were just starting to use the knee bar. And I was like, no way. Like, I'm way too ethical for that. There's this weight of like British ethics, which I'd read about in the magazines, the gritstones and all of these ethical battles that people have had. And I'll be like, no, I'm going to have strong ethics. I'm not going to use the knee pads. And then I took time out of climbing and came back to climbing, and the knee pads were just like a totally normal thing.
Mm,
However, on Hubble, I still felt that it was like a little bit funny because it wasn't the Hubble that I'd like read about and dreamed about, this test of raw power. But
right.
I think it was as soon as Matt Wright, who climbed Hubble a few weeks before me, he did it with a knee pad. And then I kind of felt silly not to use the knee pad. It would be like, like someone discovers a new hold on your project and you decide not to use it. And I think
Right.
it would have turned the route into an eliminate, which would be a very big shame to ruin such a historical route by adding rules to it. I think that sort of cheapens and dampens the piece of climbing to add those sorts of rules.
Yeah, I think that's a really smart take on it. I think one of the things that Ben and Jerry did in establishing these routes, when Liquid Amber and Hubble were, at the world leading edge, it was because they had looked at the old ethics and said, no, that doesn't make sense anymore. We're going to move on.
Yeah.
So looking at it and saying, no, that doesn't really make sense. I'm going to do this thing is sort of it's honoring what Ben and Jerry did to begin with, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just a development in equipment and in styles. Like when Ben bolted Statement of Youth, I know that people weren't too happy about that because he was using bolts.
Right.
And then there was,
Right.
I guess, the introduction of chalk and of new climbing shoes as well. And
Mhm.
I think people hear knee bar and knee pads and they think of like putting your knee in like a massive twofer and taking your hands off and have a rest.
Yeah.
But the reality is that knee barring is a skill just like hill hooking or toe hooking. And
Absolutely.
it requires practice and it requires its own set of strengths. And when you watch people like Andra, Dave Graham, Jorge climb, and these guys, I can't touch the knee bars that they're doing. They're just desperate. Like knee bars require skill and they don't always make everything like totally easy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think anyone who is listening and still thinks that knee bars are like always cheating and always just make things way easier, you should go to Waco Tanks and climb on some of the things that have now been done with knee bars. Some of them, it has made them drastically easier, but a lot of them, the knee bars are so hard to use that it's almost easier for me to not use them because I don't
Yeah.
have the knee bar skill yet.
Yeah.
I want it, I just don't have it yet.
Yeah, it's funny. I almost have to force myself to like for me, it's most of the time it's easier just to power through. And I've been like forcing myself to try the knee bar so I can, even if in that moment it's going to be harder for me, but just to learn the skill because I think it's very useful.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other debates about Hubble is, and this I think is an interesting debate that has sort of continued through a lot of climbing history, and that's whether it should be graded as a boulder or as a route.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think my thoughts on it is if you're above bouldering pads, it's a boulder problem, and if you're tying into a rope and clipping bolts, then it's a sport route. I think that Hubble is short enough for it to be a boulder problem. It's like 8 moves or something like that. But ultimately, it is a route and it has its own set of challenges. You don't clip any draws on the hard climbing, but you do climbing afterwards, and you have to keep. And I think Ben fell there, and I think Steve McClure fell there as well. You really have to
Yeah.
keep your head together, and I think that's something which is slightly different from just a pure boulder problem. But I do think that if Hubble had like a nice flat grassy landing, even though it's short, like the landing's horrible. Like you wouldn't want to do it without a rope. And if it did have a nice landing, I think it would have seen a lot more ascents than it has. But for sure, it makes sense to be graded as a route because it feels like route climbing for sure when you get up on that top head wall.
Got it. Perfect. Yeah. And when I read that Ben emailed me that he had fallen off of the top, and I had not read that yet. I've since seen it in several places, but that surprised me because all I'd heard about it was like, oh, it's this, like 7 move or so,
Yeah,
boulder problem. And then it's just easy to the top. So in my
yeah,
head,
yeah,
it was like, oh, no one's falling at the top. But the
yeah.
reality is people have fallen up there.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's the nature of the climbing up there. The part which is, I mean, I guess it has been soloed when Revelations was soloed, but it's a very sketchy type
Right.
of climbing. You have to do these big rock overs, and you're on smears. And I think it's probably like a 513A or a 7C plus, something like that. So it's not
Hmm.
totally easy. You can fall off that if you're pumped, if your hands are a little bit numb, or if you get stressed.
Yeah. Well, and the third debate is, was Hubble the first 9A in the world? And I think that's a debate for a whole separate episode because there's a lot there. There's a lot to talk about. And I want to get the opinions of some other people who have climbed or climbed on both, or who know the history well. So I do want to talk to you about this, but we're going to do that in a separate episode later this season. And I know, much to the chagrin of everyone listening, we're going to move on right past that. And I have a question for you. This episode is about Hubble, though we're also talking about Action Direct a little here and there. But like I said at the top of this episode, we can't ignore that you've done both. And there was a finger injury in between. And that finger injury, you've said, led you to train more open handed. And that led you to start considering the pockets on Action Direct. So if it weren't for the finger injury, do you think you would have gone and done Action Direct?
I mean, it was a route which I had always wanted to do. I mean, I'm sure there's many climbers that dream of climbing Action Direct, but I never saw it as an immediate thing. Um,
Mm,
but I think, like I mentioned earlier, when you consider climbing performances and what goes together to make a climbing performance, I think it's really important to consider the context. And I think the context of having a finger injury and then spending some time in Spain, getting more comfortable and more confident on pockets, is really what spurred me to try it, like in the short term. But I mean, I'd wanted to try it for years, of course.
there's this, like, if we grow up in a certain scene, or we identify with a certain scene, we tend to like block the other things out like they don't matter.
Yeah,
So I think it's great that you were still thinking about, like, you're growing up in this British scene where Hubble is like the most famous test piece in the country, and you're also thinking about Action Direct. And I think it's important to note that, Ben went and tried Action Direct
yeah,
and ended up with a finger injury on it, and, even tried to come back, but just wasn't able to climb on that route because of the finger injury. Um, so I think it's important not to, like, pigeonhole yourself into this one scene. Like, no, it's all about Hubble. Action Direct doesn't
yeah.
matter.
Yeah, yeah, and I think they're somewhat they're somewhat similar. They were both climbed by two legends of the sports, and a lot
Yeah.
of hard training went into them. And I think for me, what makes these routes inspiring, why I like the historical routes, is It's less about the grades. Of course, the difficulty's there, but it's more the characters and the stories and what led to these ascents and what they meant to me as a kid and what they still mean to me now.
Yeah, and that's why I'm doing this series. I think a lot of the context has been lost.
Yeah,
Or you have to piece it together from 20 different interviews and magazine
yeah,
articles, and there's no drama in that piecing it together. And
yeah,
I wanna put the drama, um, and the inspiration back into these stories. So for me,
yeah.
that's what this is all about. And I initially went into it thinking these stories are about the roots, they're about the ascents, but I couldn't remove the person from that because those characters were so big, so larger than life at the time. And Ben Moon obviously means a ton to UK climbing, and has reinvented himself over and over to continue meaning a lot to UK climbing. But I'm curious, what does he mean to you personally?
Oh yeah, I think Ben's definitely been a mentor of mine and been very supportive. He's helped me with my climbing, which has been cool. But it's also been something else I really respect him is the way he applies that same discipline and the same sense of like strong morals or strong ethical opinions to the rest of his life. The way he runs his
Yeah.
business seems to be um, he's really focused on trying to make sure everyone's happy, very generous with his business and looking after the next generations of climbers. But I think one of the coolest things I've noticed about Ben, which maybe explains why he's been at the top of his game for so long, and he's still down at the schoolroom on the moon board. Like it's really cool to see, and he's really strong. But he almost has this beginner's headspace or beginner's mind when he approaches
Mm,
things. And I remember being at Rubicon, which I'm sure he used to. It's a limestone crag in the Peak District with some boulder problems. There's loads of eliminates, and I'm sure he's been climbing there for years. But we were climbing there with the Moon team, and he was always asking different things, asking people what they were up to, and he was
mm.
exploring different body positions and different movements. And I found that very, very inspiring. How he's a master of the sport, but he was still humble enough and open to learning new things from lots of different people, which I found very inspiring.
Wow, that's so important. And I feel like a lot of people lose that by the time they're climbing,
Yeah,
7A plus. They're
yeah,
like,
yeah.
I know how to do this now. That's
There's always
that
something to
thanks for
learn.
sharing that. That's really important.
Yeah, cool.
When you did both Hubble and Action Direct, um, you had already climbed harder things. You'd already climbed 9A plus.
Mhm.
Why is going back to those historical roots so important to you?
Oh, yeah, I don't think it's about the numbers. Like I mentioned earlier, I think it's how they inspired me as a kid. It's like what I grew up reading. Like these roots meant so much to so many different people, and I think that's what's something really special about climbing. You can hear all of these stories, and you get to feel a little bit of it yourself. You get to feel what Ben felt in the '90s, and feel a little part of that, or experience the same holds and do the same moves that Wolfgang did. And I think that's something very, very special about climbing. I mean, you never get to go and play like on the football pitch with Pele or go and do anything like that. Like that's gone forever. But there's something about climbing which stays there, and people can come and try. And just being at Action today, like people just come to look at it. Like it's a really beautiful piece of rock, but it's
Yeah,
I guess it's the idea that it represents of really hard training, hard focus, and the whole sport climbing revolution, pardon, in the '80s came together to make these two routes. And I think that's a really cool thing that you could just go and try them.
absolutely. Does it feel different to you now walking up to those, having already climbed them?
Well, it still feels pretty special to go and look at Action Direct. It's a really, I still feel that sort of energy. Like I felt as like a 10-year-old when I go and look at that bit of rock, it still gives me some sort of goosebumps.
Wow. Man, I love it. I think that's the perfect place to wrap this thing up. Buster, I'm glad we were able to make this happen while you're trotting around the globe. I love that you've chased down some of this history while also embracing the new methods and the new ethics. In my opinion, that's exactly how history should be used. I think that's the most responsible way to use it, kind of as motivation and inspiration and as a stepping stone for how to do things better. So if we get too romantic about it, it threatens to hold us back. So I'm psyched that you're moving forward.
Yeah, man, it was a pleasure to chat to you, and I really like the idea of spreading these stories and these history to all the history to a wider audience. It's really cool.
Man, thank you. Thank you for doing this.
Nice one, pleasure.
All right, Written in Stone is produced by me, Kris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush and Emily Holland for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. The link in your show notes, you'll find all the things you expect and probably some you don't. And look, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. If you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review and tell everyone you know at the crag, at the gym, follow the pod on your friends' phones and share it all over your social medias, and together we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, 1 decade at a time. Shh. This is the Secret Stoners Club. Meeting is in session. Actually, I'm whispering because my voice is wrecked. I've been doing a lot of interviews recently, and Harper, my 16-month-old, decided I needed to catch her cold or whatever it is she had. I guess that happens when they sleep on your chest for several days in a row. So I've got a cold, and that means interviews are halted for the moment, though I did one this morning in my rough voice, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But first, it occurs to me that if I start this by saying, "Hey, stoners," or something like that, and people didn't hear the first Secret Stoners Club, they're not going to know what the hell to think. Sorry, I had to pause that for just a second. Harper woke up while I was recording. Now she's right here at the mic. Do you want to say hi, Harps? Yeah? Can you say turtle? When we first encountered a turtle, I whispered it, and that's how she learned it. So that's how she says it every time now. What are you gonna say? Say uh-oh.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh, turtle. Uh-oh, turtle. Not going for the combining of words just yet. Okay, where were we? It occurs to me that the Stoners Club will confuse the hell out of anyone who's hearing it for the first time. And honestly, I'm okay with that. Be confused. You can always go back and listen. These things are still there. Anyway, I really loved this conversation with Buster. It was a ton of fun to record with him, and I look forward to having him on the training podcast as well, because I like his coaching philosophy, and I just like his overall philosophy in general. He's definitely not a grade chaser, and he takes great pains to say, I'm not climbing these routes just for the grade. I'm doing it for the history and for the mystique, and I love that. I think it's a really really valuable way to go for your climbing, to follow those things, and the grades will come, right? Because if you're climbing something for the sake of history, it probably made a historical impact. And usually that's related to the grade in some way, shape, or form, from some time period. So I think it's a great way to go. I also want to let you in on a little behind the scenes secret here, because we've got a bonus episode coming up in just a couple of days. It will appear in your feed with another one of the UK's best climbers, certainly the UK's best climber for a number of years. And this happened, and it's going to happen multiple times throughout this season, because as I was preparing for this podcast, I decided I better message multiple people, because some of these people are not going to get back to me. Some of them are just going to, talk to me at first and then ghost me. So I need to have somebody for each episode. And in a few cases, several of those people have messaged me back, and I want to talk to all of them. So that's what I'm doing. And I just recorded this morning with this person, and it was a really fun conversation, getting to talk about these full circle moments that he's had with Ben Moon across the evolution of his own climbing. A pun intended there, but not the direct pun. So if you follow the pun too closely, you might not get it. All right, you guys, I'm going to let my voice rest here. Again, there is going to be a giveaway just for all of you stoners in a couple of weeks. All right, Harps, you want to say bye now that you're fully awake?
Bye.
All right, you guys, thank you for listening, and I'll see you again in just a couple of days.